My parents were Dale Reed and Mary Cusick Reed. Feeding chickens, milking cows, and anything to do with the farm. We only had 10 acres, which was where the chicken houses were. And then we had a milk cow and a big garden, of course. That was about it. I fed chickens and cleaned waters and did whatever Dad told me to do. I guess my first job was mowing the lawn for Mrs. Harris. I think it paid me 75 cents, and it was a pretty big lawn, but I did that, and then when I was 13, I went to work for Bill Nolan, driving a tractor, pulling the Easy Flow. He came over to the house and tried to get Dad to work for him, and Dad couldn't do it, but he suggested I do it. And so I went over there, but before I did, I told Dad I'd never driven one of the kind of tractors Bill had. And then Dad said, well, you just tell him that. So when I was climbing up on that C International tractor, I told Mr. Nolan, I said, I've never driven this kind of tractor. And he laughed and said, well, I could see by the way you were looking at it that you hadn't, appreciate you admitting it. So he taught me how to drive a C International with a tricycle front end on it and turn it in the loose dirt, and we made it fine. I worked for him. He died, and then I worked for Mrs. Nolan until I was in college. I went to Carl Albert, it was Poto Community College then, on the basketball and baseball scholarship, and then I transferred to the University of Arkansas. My first job out of college was working for the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I first applied at the Prairie Grove Telephone Company and Donald Parks, and I didn't get hired, and so I walked out, and the next door I came to was the Farmers and Merchants Bank, so I decided I had to start somewhere, so I walked in there, and the first answer was no, but they called me about 3 days later and offered me a job. I was a teller, and Judy Carter trained me, and I worked as a regular teller for about a year, and then I moved over to note teller, which was what Jim Reef was doing until he moved to a loan desk. And then in 1974, they remodeled the bank and made me a loan officer that year. 1969 was the first when I started to work there, and I was the 11th employee, and I think our assets, our total footings were like $6.2 million, and today it's well over $200 million. Well, basically taking payments on notes and sending out notices, and at that time we had escrow contracts, were contracts between two individuals, and we acted as an agent and collected the payments on those and distributed the funds. Well, we would they would send their payments into us, we would figure the interest and credit it to the note, and then disperse the funds. Delford Reef was the first manager. He was the president of the bank when I initially started, and we used to get laughed at by the state bank examiners because we were the only bank in Arkansas that had a no smoking sign on the door. Delford Reef was allergic to cigarette smoke, so we had no smoking in the bank. and banks used to give out matchbooks, and we stopped that when we stopped the smoking in the bank. And but Delford taught me a lot about banking. He I'm trying to think of some of the things that he taught me. Oh, one of the things he always said was kind of interesting was you couldn't borrow your way out of debt. And a lot of people tried to do that. They thought the way to get out of debt was just borrow more money and get bigger. And that wasn't the case with a lot of them. I guess my earliest memories of coming to Prairie Grove were on Saturday on the Trades Day, and you couldn't find a place to park. You would go down the street where the old police department is and the Arvest Drive-In Bank and make a U-turn and come back and then go down to the station the other side of the old Tasco store and make another U-turn until you found a parking place. And you always go to the Crescent department store, and Elton Skelton was running it then. He had taken it over from his dad, Guy, and I remember anytime you walked in, Elton would say hello and call you by name and come on in, we'll be with you in just a minute. And he was quite the salesman. Well, there was Carmen Drug Store. I remember when I was going to have my tonsils out, and we stopped by the drugstore, and somehow Mrs. Carmen, Riata Carmen, found out I was going to have my tonsils out, and she gave me 3 comic books to read, and I'll never forget that. And there was Neil's Dry Goods and the Harlan Variety Store. I always enjoyed going in there and looking at all the stuff in the Bride Dime store. Well, other than the bank and I guess we did a little bit with Southern Mercantile, Florence Hill. But mainly it was Crescent Department Store and the Carmen Drug Store, or the Sterling Drug Store. They both had fountains, as I recall, soda fountains, and we would go in there and get a soda, and that was a big treat. In 1986, I left Farmers and Merchants Bank after 17 years and went to Clinton, Arkansas, to a new bank as president of that bank. And I was only in Clinton for about 6 months when Jim Walton called, and I wound up coming back to Prairie Ridge as president of the Bank of Prairie Ridge. And I worked there until November of 1990, and that's when Arvest bought First Federal of Fayetteville, which was a failed institution that had a branch in Prairie Grove. And I came to it, and we changed the name to First Prairie Grove Bank, and we were there for 2 years. And in 1992, we purchased Farmers and Merchants Bank and operated it as Farmers and Merchants until 2001, and we changed the name then to Arvest and consolidated all the Arvest banks under one charter. Well, that was kind of strange. Jim Walton called me one day and said, I want you to go by either the Farmers and Merchants Bank or the Bank of Lincoln or both of them. And I said, well, Jim, I've never done anything like that. And he said, you go talk to them, and if they're interested, I'll send Rick Chapman down to help you. And so that's what I did. Bank of Lincoln wasn't interested, but Farmers and Merchants people were interested, So that's why we wound up buying them. I knew most of the people there. There were some new ones that had come since I had been there before, but most of the old hands, Judy Carter and Lavon Hall and Pat Holloway and Pat Hand and Carolyn Boyle and Sandy Whitehouse, they were all still there. So it was kind of like coming home. I knew most of them. Arvest made a lot of changes. We did things a lot different than what the old Farmers and Merchants Bank, and for the most part it was accepted pretty well by the employees. There was a few that decided they couldn't live with the changes and moved on, but by and large most of them stayed and retired there. It was about 50 million when we first took it over. And then we combined First Prairie Grove with it, and that made it about 60 million. And then it was about 210 million when I retired in August of 14. It was different, and the customers had to get used to a lot of things different, but I can tell you from experience, the regulators looked at small banks and big banks a lot different. And while I didn't think of Arvest as a big bank, the examiners did. And so they were much tougher in some ways and more detailed in their examinations. But by and large, we just went into what we called a sales mode and started working on the sales of our products, and banking is banking, and everybody pretty much offered the same products at that time, so you had to differentiate yourself basically by customer service, and delivering quality customer service was a high priority with Arvest. Initially, Arvest operated their banks as independent banks. Each one had their own charter. So I was given the latitude to operate pretty much however I felt a small town needed to operate. And Delford had taught me a lot about investments and lending money, and Jim Reef and Wilfred Thompson, of course, were there when I was there the first time, and I learned some things from all of them, and it basically transferred over pretty well to Arvest. Like I said, we had our own board, we had our own policies for the first 10 or 12 years before regulations made it, or almost required it, to consolidate all the charters into one bank. And then I felt like we were looked at differently by the examiners. They became more nitpicky, I'd say. But actually it was very similar. The regulations have just increased over the years and got more and more stringent and made it more and more difficult to take care of the customers the way they were used to being taken care of in Prairie Grove. We added the drive-in bank. We didn't have room in the back alley for an expansion of the drive-in facilities, so we built one, bought the old Conoco service station down on the corner of Neal and Mock, and built a new drive-in facility there. We built a new bank in Farmington, and then we built one in West Fork and one in Lincoln. And we served 4 communities, and as president of the bank, I was over those 4 communities. Oh, there were several. The local merchants, probably Guy Sparks, who had the old IGA store right across the street. Elton Skelton. Elton used to finance a lot of cars. He'd sell cars on the side. And he would finance those, and we buy those notes from him. And I enjoyed dealing with him. I don't know, there were so many that I enjoyed. Kenny Bartholomew had the B&K grocery down the street. Howard Fiddler and Mike Fiddler had the old Tasco store, and of course there was the Parks brothers that had the telephone company. I always enjoyed my interaction with all them. I knew a lot of the people down around Morrow who did business with the bank. A lot of the farmers, the Quintons and the McCradocks, and of course the Reeds and first one and the Cusicks. There was a lot of them, and I always enjoyed visiting with the old hometown folks. When I grew up in Morrow and Lincoln, we'd come to Prairie Grove to check out the girls. And I wound up marrying a girl from Prairie Grove. But yeah, I felt like I was accepted pretty well. If you treat them right, they'd treat you right. Well, I remember driving by the Battlefield Park on Labor Day weekend and the clothesline fair, and I had never been to it until I moved to Prairie Grove. And then the Lions Club always had the concessions and ran the concession part of the Labor Day celebration and the square dancing. And I remember when I first moved here, we'd square dance at the Ladder Barn, and the Lions Club would build a stage out there, and there was maybe 20 groups that square dance. And now then I think there's better than 60 groups that square dance down at the amphitheater in the park. But I guess one of my first memories of Battlefield Park is working up there during Labor Day. I think one of the biggest deals you've already seen and heard about was the water tower that fell on the Crescent department store. I was standing across the street watching the operation, and it was kind of a shocking moment when it fell and you realized it had hit the Crescents and B&K Market and all that. But that was probably one of the most traumatic times. I served on a group that Donald Parks actually started to get a medical clinic here in Prairie Grove. And the Parks family donated the land and most of the cash to build the clinic. And it was a rural health clinic, and then later turned over to Manna, which now operates First Prairie Grove. But the Parks family, and Donald Parks in particular, was very instrumental in getting that started. And without them, it wouldn't have happened. The specific examples were like the paving of the parking lot behind the stores on the south side of the street. They couldn't come up with enough money, so Arvest Bank and the Parks family put up a good portion of the money to pave that parking lot back there. And they were always doing something to help the community. Donald Parks got in trouble a few times for mowing property. His philosophy, as he told me one time, was you need to mow your lawn 3 days before it needs it. And he was a very civic-minded person. He served on the city council, and I remember I was recorder treasurer for the city, and we had a meeting, and we had a new sheriff or marshal in town, and you could tell he gave a report every council meeting, and you could tell he was very proud of himself because he had written 134 tickets that month, and he was looking for the council to pat him on the back for the revenue he had raised. And Donald Parks spoke up and said, "Well, I'll tell you when I'll be proud of you is when you can come in here and say you didn't have to write a single ticket. Then I'll know you're doing your job." And I thought that had a lot of deep meaning to it. And you had to respect Donald because he didn't want Prairie Grove to become known as a feed trap. And the next month, their feeding tickets were way down, but so were the feed trucks. The traffic, the speed way down. So I think he was successful getting his point across. Well, actually, I was a recorder treasurer for 4 years, and during that time, I think we hired our first clerk because the city was growing, had more business, and needed a full-time recorder treasurer. Of course, I was only part-time. During that time, I wound up serving 6 months as the acting mayor because the mayor resigned, and that was a very interesting time, what all the mayor had to put up with and do, and I was more than happy to give up that job. The year was between 70 and 74. And I remember one night the phone ringing in the middle of the night, and I answered it, and there was a lady complaining about the neighbor had a rooster crowing and was waking her up and keeping her awake. And she asked me what I was going to do about it. And I said, well, other than having chicken and dumplings for dinner, I don't know anything I can do. And she hung up. But I called the people and they got rid of the rooster. One time I know when I was still recorder treasurer, Lee King, who had moved here, owned some property where Magnatech was located. It was just a field in, and the city was looking for some land to start an industrial park. And Lee was asking a pretty high price for that 10 acres down there that he owned. And so I suggested we sit down and negotiate with him. So me and Mayor Manning met with him and wound up buying the property for the first industrial park in Prairie Grove, which was where Magnatech first built their building. It's now Specialty Fasteners has the property. But that was kind of interesting because Donald Parks was the kind of guy that if you priced something, that's what you wanted for it. And he wasn't for buying the property at the price. And he made a motion before the council not to buy it at that price. And I suggested we meet with him, with Lee King, and try to negotiate a price. And Donald said, no, if that's what he wants, that's what he wants. But the rest of the council decided we could meet with him and try to negotiate a price, and we did, and that's how we got it bought. We met at the old dairy diner or Dairy Queen or whatever it was called downtown Prairie Grove. Lee was operating it at that time. And we talked to him and made him an offer on the property, which he accepted. It was the first really big employer other than the school that Prairie Grove had. So it provided local jobs, and I know one of the things they had to do to get them to come was waive the property tax for so many years. And Universal Electric and then Magnatech made a contribution to the schools in lieu of taxes. So I never understood why they were so interested in avoiding the property tax when the donations they made to the school were higher than what the taxes would have been. Our schools were recently rated as number 7 in the state of Arkansas, and I think that was pretty impressive. But it's a good place to live. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the businesses that we did have. We turned into kind of a antique store flea market kind of town. We got a great community atmosphere, and the school is probably what everything is centered around, and the school activities. And we have a quality city government that provides good services, and the telephone company is undoubtedly one of the better things in the state. I've lived in 3 different communities, and I can tell you from experience, Prairie Grove Telephone Company is among the top.